This is the Rocky Flats Cold War Museum Oral History Project. I'm interviewing Ed Kray. It's the 3rd of February 2005. I'm Hannah Nordhaus, and we are in a conference room at Rocky Flats. So Ed, to get started, if you could just tell me a little bit about your background, where you grew up, how you got into the field you're in.
Okay. I grew up in Cleveland and spent the first 35 years there until 1980. And at the time back in Cleveland, I was a high school chemistry teacher for 10 years. Moved out here continuing to do that and did not find a chemistry teaching position, ended up working at the health department in the laboratory. And primarily in the radiochemistry laboratory, where we did the analyses on a lot of Rocky Flats samples. From the laboratory, and nobody stays in the laboratory long because it's the world's most boring job. I moved to the radiation control division, spent probably the next 8 years inspecting the uranium mills out in the western slope. That was great. I liked that. And then around about 1992, we had a fellow who was the state representative out here, Al Hazel. I don't know if you've interviewed Al yet. Okay. And Al decided he was going to retire and he needed somebody to come out here and take his position. And I moved into that, and I've been here since 1992.
So when did you first find out about what was going on at Rocky Flats?
You know, being a foreigner from back east, in 1980 I knew nothing about Rocky Flats. You'd see things on the news in town, but when I first started to really become familiar with it was when I started to have to handle water samples for Rocky Flats in the lab. We would do the water samples from the ponds, the A and B series ponds, and we would do soil samples that were sent in from various areas around the plant site. So that was the beginning of it.
And your lab work was simply analyzing those samples?
Yeah.
And then in radiation control, what are you doing then in radiation control?
Oh, yeah, no, that lab work, that was in the early 80s, 80, 81, 82. And we were quite proud of ourselves because we were the only state health department in the country that would do a plutonium analysis, as far as I know.
Even out in Washington and Tennessee?
Yeah, as far as I know, we were the only state health department who did that. And then I moved into radiation control it was probably about 83, 84. And for that next 7, 8, 9 years, something like that, 8 to 10, I didn't do much with Rocky Flats because I was off in the western slope looking at the uranium mills.
And so radiation control is more, as opposed to the lab analysis, radiation control is your picture? Or
it's two different groups.
Okay, right.
The lab is a separate group from radiation control.
So what is radiation control trying to do specifically?
With Rocky Flats or overall?
Overall, what's their mission?
Oh, overall they regulated, and that's a good starting point, they regulate all the, and I'll use the term, licensed sources of radiation in the state. And that includes everything from starting big, the uranium mills, the uranium mill tailings piles, the big program in Grand Junction where they had a 20-year cleanup of the tailings that people buried in their basements, used as fill dirt, down to other things like hospitals with their radiation sources and the radionuclides they use, the X-ray program in the state, any source of radiation.
So, working out on the western slope, you were looking at, were they functioning uranium mills or?
At the time we started, they were. Yes. There was one active uranium mill in a town called Yerevan, and then the other one, and this one is still active in Canyon City, the Cutter Mill. which still makes the news on occasion.
Yeah, I've heard about that. So from there, then that was after that. Then you came to Rocky Flats,
Mhm.
right? And what was it like to come on site and in this capacity? And maybe if you could.
I mean, if you
describe-
have to pick one word, the word is fascinating. I mean, it was a whole new world. This was an amazing place. In 1992, they were essentially shut down. I mean, we started to hear more about Rocky Flats in the news with the EPA raid in 1989, and that's when the health department really started to get involved with Rocky Flats. And by 1992, they were essentially shut down because of the raid. There was a lot of controversy, and the intent at that time, and everybody, most people out here, fully intended to start up again and start producing weapons. They were going through a lot of procedure writing, getting their ducks in a row, going through, what do they call them, readiness reviews to get the buildings back up and producing again. And most of the staff was planning on that. And then, of course, in 1992, the major change took place when, who was it at the time? I think it was President Bush? And the administration decided that Rocky Flats would not continue as a production facility. And through those first 3 years, it was interesting to see the mindset change from production to decommissioning.
Were you there when the announcement was made? Had you come on
Yes.
site yet?
Yeah.
What was that like?
Yeah.
That day?
I don't remember the day in particular, but although they had hoped to produce, I think the people I was working with took it well. They weren't really surprised at all.
Who were the people you were working with?
Oh gosh, at that time it was mostly DOE. Have you talked to Bob Nelson?
No,
Have you
I haven't.
interviewed?
I don't know. He may have been interviewed by someone else. But
Okay.
The name is.
He's one
relevant.
person who will give you a fascinating interview. Bob Nelson was the DOE manager at the time. To say that he was a unique individual and personality is an understatement. Prior to Bob Nelson coming out, late 80s, maybe 1990, 1991, this place was shrouded in secrecy. And the DOE brought Bob Nelson out, and Bob Nelson, it's hard to understand. He was, yes, he worked for the Department of Energy, and he knew the nuclear weapons complex and everything involved, but he was also a minister back in Nevada. So he had a really unique personality, and he brought with him a strategy of openness with the community.
So he was your major.
He was my major contact out here, one of them.
And how long did you work with him?
Oh, he was here for a couple more years. He took the assignment not because he really wanted to come here, but because they needed him, and he always wanted to go back to Las Vegas. So he was here for a couple of years before he got transferred back to Vegas, which really was his home.
So
And when he went back, I think he was, I don't know his exact title, but he was certainly involved with the top-level management of the, what do they call the site there where they're burying the high-level waste?
Yucca Mountain.
Yes, Yucca Mountain.
So he's, yeah, I do. He is on our list.
Okay.
Everybody said,
You need to
"Gotta
talk
go
to Bob
Vegas."
Bob Nelson. He's an amazing person. I mean, the attitude of openness with the state that he brought with him was amazing and refreshing and wonderful.
And when did he come on site?
I'm going to take a guess at 1989,
Okay.
maybe 1990.
So you had said that the State Health Department was the only one to do plutonium sampling.
Analysis.
Analysis.
Anyway, the actual wet chemistry.
The actual lab work.
Yeah.
Okay. And
Other health departments would send it out to someone else.
So they still looked at it. So why do you know what the impetus was to be the only state?
Oh, Rocky Flats, definitely. We're probably the only state that really recognized the plutonium problem in the environment.
Though it was obviously in other places.
Hanford, New Mexico, sure.
And was this because of specific events that the public health department got involved?
What was his name? There was a health department director from Jefferson County, and I can't think of his name right now because that was 14 years ago. But he did some sampling and he found plutonium in the soil, in the environment, yeah, and that brought out a lot of public outrage.
Were you at the health department at the time?
Yes.
Do you recall?
Although I wasn't working on Rocky Flats at the time, so I'd just see it in the newspapers.
So you don't recall sort of the health department's response to that and how it decided to get more involved?
I couldn't give you details.
Okay. I wonder if you could describe what it was like the first time you came on site. One of the things that we were trying to do is sort of, we have a grant from the State Historical Fund, which restores buildings, and we're doing an oral history. We can't restore these buildings, obviously, so we sort of want to describe what went on in them. So I'm particularly interested. I've gotten lots of great descriptions, especially from people who didn't work there their entire careers, about sort of their perception of what this place was like from an outsider's point of view.
It was certainly different from the rest of the world. Okay, I mean, back in 1992 when I first came out, it was so different from what it is today. I mean, there were armored vehicles on site. The guards all carried, I don't know one rifle from another, but the great big automatic rifles, and were all over the place, and security was a major concern. It was quite a surprise.
What was it, had you been on, you had worked in uranium mills, or not in, but with uranium mills. How did it compare to other industrial facilities you've been at?
Well, the security was the big difference, certainly. And then once you got inside the buildings and start looking around, you realize what they do here is so much more complex than a uranium mill. A uranium mill is a simple operation. You take the rock, you crush it, you mix it with acid, let it leach out, and then separate it, and it's done on a large scale, but it's simple chemically. Here what they were doing is really complex.
So did you visit, did you visit all the production buildings?
The simple answer is yes. Okay. And that was part of the Bob Nelson openness. The State Health Department had access to any area on the site. We were given and there are very few people out here who still have Q clearances, which give you access to any. Well, one of the reasons is you don't really need them anymore. But the State Health Department employees, and there was a unit. There was a unit of us, a dozen and a half, who focused on Rocky Flats. And we were given Q clearances and access to any area of the site, as long as we followed the appropriate safety precautions, and in most cases we made sure we were escorted by someone who knew the area.
So were there specific buildings that stood out in your mind that were especially notable from a sort of someone's perspective not working there?
They were all amazing. Okay, they really were. The production buildings, 707 and 776 and 771, completely filled with glove boxes. interesting to say the least. Yeah. 776 is one that I'm still working on, and it's my last remaining project, and that's the one that I find most fascinating, because that was the site of the 1969 fire, and decommissioning it has been and still is a challenge. But we have about, what is today, February 4th? Got about 2 weeks until it starts coming down. And 6 years ago, everyone in the outside world said it would be impossible. It'd just be impossible to decommission this building. It'll take 40 years. We'll never get it decontaminated. It's and we're 2 weeks away from doing it, which is exciting.
So what was the secret to getting it done in 6 years rather than 40?
Number one, the difficulty was overestimated. Okay, it really was. Number two, and you really have to give credit to Kaiser Hill and their management and their organization. Number one, and number two, we need to give credit to the plutonium workers, the steel workers. Both of them have solved the problem working together.
How did they solve it? And I guess what was the difficulty?
It's on a couple that answer comes in a couple levels. Okay. On the macro level, the organization was a big part of their solving the problem. They just, what else can I say besides they were organized? They organized their projects. They discovered what the difficulties would be, and they worked their way through them. On the macro level, on the micro level, the way they got it, have you ever heard of integrated safety management? It was a big buzzword out here some years ago. But it's the process they use to manage things safely, and it involves not just management, but it involves the workers, and it involves getting the workers to help solve the problems. And this really it's been a big part of it. On a minor level, for example, okay?
Hey, can I stop you 1 second?
Sure.
Okay.
On a minor level, here's 200 feet of pipe, and the pipe is contaminated on the inside. How do you take it apart and put it into a waste box to send it away to Nevada as low-level waste without the workers being exposed? And this is where they came into play, and the workers helped devise these detailed methods to do this. Little things like the use of a vacuum, and here's a hose coming from the vacuum, and they would take, for example, old plastic bottles, okay, and cut those into funnels and put it on the end of the tube and place that near the place where they'd have to make the cut in the piping, which would pull the contamination away into the vacuum and out of their breathing zone. But it's the workers who developed those little details that made taking this place apart possible. And that's one of the principles of integrated safety management. Writing up these work packages, and the managers write out the basics, and then you take it to the workers, and the workers look at the details and say, hey, we can make this better here by using a vacuum to do this, all sorts of details.
Was that a new?
It was new
innovation
here.
around the flats?
It
Yeah,
was new
so the
here.
workers are
I
not
don't know who devised the principle overall, but it certainly was new here.
And previously the workers had it was a top-down
Yeah,
process.
yeah.
So when people said it was going to take 40 years, was nobody able to even break it down into these smaller units to conceptually to think about how to do
Nobody
it?
did until Kaiser Hill came out and said they could do it.
So you preceded Kaiser Hill at Rocky Flats.
Yes, I did.
What can you describe the transition from? Was it from EG&G to Kaiser Hill? Is that?
I thought it would be difficult. It wasn't too difficult. Because really what happened is, although a few top managers changed, most of the rest of the people who were here, and there were at the time I think 7,000, they stayed right on. And they just became a part of a new organization, so it wasn't too difficult.
Did you have a sense about how the morale was affected by all these various, the announcement in 1992, the change of management, the switch to clean up?
Morale was pretty bad at the time of the changeover, okay? And I think there were a lot of workers who were disappointed that they weren't going to get to produce bombs again, okay? And it really took a couple of years for them to start to put together a plan for decommissioning. Even after they stopped to produce, they didn't know what they were going to do. They didn't know they were going to decommission, and if they, in the back of their minds, knew that, they didn't know when or how soon or how they were going to go about it. There were still managers out here, and one name comes to mind is a DOE manager named Silverman. And he was trying to, this was probably about 94, rather than focusing on decommissioning, he was focusing on a project to get a new plutonium vault, storage vault, built out here. And thank goodness that never happened.
Was someone telling him to do this, or was this just his own initiative?
I don't know if headquarters was involved, but he was certainly behind the project. And what I thought was particularly amazing were the people from Boulder, and by that I mean decidedly liberal environmental types, were behind him on it. They said, yes, do this, because this is the only way safe way to store the plutonium. We don't want it sent somewhere else to New Mexico or to New Mexico or Hanford or Savannah River. It should be safely stored here. And that made no sense to me. I mean, had that happened, this place would have never been decommissioned by next year.
So that they weren't thinking of it as a permanent solution, but that the plutonium as it currently was stored was not safe, that they needed a safer storage facility.
Yeah.
While it was being decommissioned or something. Okay. Could you describe? You mentioned that your last project is Building 776. Could you describe your specific role in the decommissioning of 776?
Sure. Well, let me go back a bit. At one time, when I first came out here in 1992, I was a real generalist. I watched everything that happened on the plant site. I was the state's on-site representative, and the job was to... Don't move, all right.
You can move.
The job was to pretty much monitor everything that went on out here. Once we got into the decommissioning phase, we broke things down and organized them. I got buildings 779 and 707 and 776. Other people in our organizations, Denise, she got buildings 559 and 371 and 771. There's a fellow named Dave Kruchek who has the South Side buildings, the depleted uranium buildings. And so we kind of funneled into handling separate buildings. And since then, our jobs have been to oversee the decommissioning of these specific buildings. And your question was, what do we do to do that?
Yeah.
Okay. It started off with planning. They had to write decommissioning operations plans and submit them to the state, and the state people would look at these and I'll still use the word argue about how the plans are written and try to get specifics included. And so for the first couple of years, it was a lot of planning on how they're going to do decommissioning. Mm-hmm. And then probably for the last 4 or 5 years, it's been implementation. It's been a matter of going into the buildings, not every day, but a couple times a week, and watching the people work. Early on, it was watching them. For example, take for me, I'm a rad guy. We've got people who care more about water and people who care more about air, but I care about the rad safety aspect of things. And so I'd go into the buildings and I'd watch them work, and I'd watch the details and try to make sure that they are doing things right, that they're not exposing the workers. My view has always been, if we protect the workers, and if the workers are not being exposed, then nothing's getting out of the building to the communities.
Makes sense. So were there ever any, when you went into these buildings and monitored, were there ever any alarming instances or events?
Nothing earth-shaking. I mean, there would be times when I might notice somebody didn't have his hood on correctly, or and you'd mention that to the management, and they'd make sure that it was fixed. But we really didn't see too many major mistakes made. There were mistakes that we didn't see and that we heard about. For example, early on in taking apart Building 779, they went into a room and they were taking out the piping, and there was a little hose, and they cut through the piping and not realizing the pipe was filled with plutonium fluoride. Okay? And it filled the room, and the cams went off, and the workers were okay because they had enough protective clothing on. Mm-hmm. They had respirators and so forth. But it took them another month to clean up the mess they made in the room before they could get back into really taking the glove boxes and the pipes and things out.
Was that a failure?
Things like that happened.
Was that a failure of communication, or just people don't know what's where because the building's been altered so much?
I think we called it a failure in work control, okay? In supervising the workers to the point where they had taken the appropriate precautions when they cut through the pipe.
So they were not supervised enough in that respect, or they didn't take the appropriate precautions.
Yeah.
Well, here's a question. I'm assuming that you've probably looked at a lot of building plans for 776. If you compared the as-builts to what you actually found there, what would the comparison be? I'm not an
engineer. There were some building plans that came by my desk just last week for 76, and I look at these, and they were engineering drawings, and they did me no good. So no, I haven't done that.
You haven't. Have you or have the workers found what you expected to find in every room? And were there informal alterations to
as far as structure?
Processes, or I don't know about structural or the line, the production line.
That hasn't been an issue. That's my answer. Things have not been drastically different from what they knew about was there. If anything, in decommissioning, there have been rumors and exaggerations that have not held up to be true. An example of that is what we call buried equipment in Building 776. Rumor had it that after the '69 fire, and it took about a year, 2 years to clean up after that and get the building back operating, that the operators at the time had taken a lot of highly contaminated equipment and put it into pits in the floor and just cemented over it. And that it would be difficult to impossible to clean that up when it came to decommissioning time. Probably 2 years ago, one of the projects in 776 was to investigate the buried equipment. They bored into those pits and they took samples, and many of them surprised us in showing nothing at all. There was one area they called it the autoclave. It was a cylindrical pit, probably going down about 20 or 30 feet into the ground. And not knowing exactly what took place in it, we feared the worst. And when they did their sampling, they found no contamination in it at all.
Even like the water from the fire and the...
Yeah. That one was a real surprise. They found a couple of other of the pits where there were a couple little scraps of metal, and we're going to have to be very careful, but they did not find the huge pieces of equipment that were rumored to have been buried there.
Huh. That's interesting. A couple of people mentioned to me that they were concerned about the fact that the cleanup only goes to a certain level under the ground. Wondering what your response is to that, or what issues with decommissioning buildings you've worked on.
Who's going to see this tape? Who's going to see this tape?
It's up to you. Probably nobody for a while.
All right. Because I have an opinion on that, yes. Okay? And the opinion is that if this site is used as the government predicts it will be, as a wildlife refuge, the buried contamination will not be an issue for wildlife workers or hikers or so forth. My belief is that it will not be used, and this is personal opinion, as the federal government predicts it will be. Okay? My belief, may I ask where you live? What community?
Boulder.
Boulder. You know what land is worth in the Denver area. The lady behind our back fence passed away and had 10 acres, and it sold for $1.3 million, and there's a developer putting $800,000 houses on it as we speak. Land in the Denver area will keep getting more and more and more valuable. And if you look at the long term, I'm not talking about 10 years or 20 years or 30 years. If you look at 100 years, the land out here is going to be so valuable to developers. There is going to be they're going to want to put houses on it. And as things stand right now, this land is useless for that, at least the land in the industrial area. And it's going to be worthwhile to do it over and do it right and make the land free releasable someday. That is my personal opinion.
But not now? Or it's just not politically feasible?
Right now, politically, there's not enough desire to do it.
What is the level? It's below the ground that they are cleaning up?
It depends. I mean, they're leaving... That's the year. Aren't they leaving 7 nanocuries or something? Below 3 feet? Yeah.
Below 3 feet. And anything above that has to be exhumed?
They're leaving what? The surface level is 50 picocuries per gram. I know that one.
And then 3 feet is sort of the
It's
level
much,
at
much
which-
higher.
Have you come across, or are you aware of stuff down there that more than just dirt that
Myself, I'm concerned right now with getting the buildings down above ground, so I haven't spent a lot of time looking at below the building level.
I was told to ask you what you thought about the cleanup levels that have been agreed upon for the site.
They're a reasonable compromise. Based on the usage of the land as a wildlife refuge. The original cleanup levels from the Rocky Flats cleanup agreement, I was very much opposed to. And the fact that they went back and reevaluated that and came up with a much reduced cleanup level, at least at the surface, is a good thing. They might have taken it a little bit lower, but for a wildlife refuge, it's protective.
If it were housing or
Yeah.
higher use, you would be more concerned.
I definitely would.
And what is your rationale in feeling that way about those levels in terms of your background with radiation?
That's a really good question. Okay. People like to talk in terms of what is a safe level. I don't think you can define that. Okay? Radiation is it's a stochastic, it's a probabilistic phenomena. All right? The more radiation, the more risk. The less radiation, the less risk. When does it become no risk? When does it become a safe risk? It's every individual's choice to draw that line as to what's safe. As state health department experts, we're supposed to be able to help them with that, but if you have any knowledge in history of environmental work, you know that doesn't work. Because if you define a level, somebody will come up and say, that's not safe. I don't think it's safe. It's not safe for me. So it's a difficult question. What is the safe level? Now, what was that your original question, or did I go off on a tangent?
Well, just how your background informed your opinion,
Okay.
your personal opinion on that.
Yeah. I've had a keen interest in what is the safe level. Back in, gosh, was it 1978? I mean, my old boss, Al Hazel, established, they promulgated a rule on what they considered to be a safe level in the lands around Rocky Flats. This was before we could get on the property here. And it was fairly conservative. It was, I think, something like in the range of 2 picocuries per gram, okay, versus the 50 they're using here now. When they first set up these standards, they were looking at, what was the number? 1,700 picocuries per gram is what they wanted to leave in the surface. Okay? So going down to 50 with the involvement of the community is a big improvement. I wouldn't build houses on it. I wouldn't live on it. But for what they're going to use the land for, it works.
Are you comfortable working on it?
Yes, completely.
Yeah.
Completely. You know, and that was for, you know, what is a safe level of radiation? What is a safe level of sunlight? Okay, because they have similar effects. We live in it every day, and if you just get too much, it's going to cause skin cancer. And nobody is, I don't know if anybody has defined a safe level of sunlight. What's the safe level of dental x-rays? Same thing.
Impossible to
Yeah.
determine. But you seem to have reached a personal conclusion about that.
Well, your question was, do I feel safe working out here? And the answer is yes. Yeah.
I'm wondering if you've ever had, sounds like in the Bill Nelson era, things became easier. Did you ever have difficulty getting access to what you needed, information, areas of the plant, that sort of thing?
Generally, no. Yeah, the answer is generally no. I can think of one instance when there was a meeting on something that would have been embarrassing to Kaiser Hill where somebody managed to keep me out of it, but not to areas of the plant.
What was the something?
Oh, she was an attorney. She was doing whatever she could to protect Kaiser Hill. It was silly.
Did you have to, you weren't able to attend?
Right.
And did you make a stink about it so it didn't happen again?
Yeah, I did.
And was Kaiser Hill responsive in their way?
Not in that instance.
What was the meeting about?
I don't even remember. It was 10 years ago.
Okay. Wondering if you can tell me how local, state, or national politics has affected your job here.
On a local level, we had a lieutenant governor who was in charge of the Rocky Flats project. And let me just say that I attribute the fact that we had way too high cleanup levels out here to the fact that she was in a big hurry to get a cleanup agreement done.
Mm-hmm. That we have now, or that we
Had.
the 1700?
Had.
That was Gail Shetler?
Yes.
And
I was not impressed with her handling of the Rocky Flats situation at all. Let me just leave it at that.
this was probably a pre-election.
It was right before she ran for governor. Mm-hmm.
What about on the local level in terms of, you mentioned Boulder and...
On a local level, the public has been nothing but a huge help in getting this place cleaned up. Okay? The people from Broomfield and Westminster just kept putting pressure on this place to clean it up and do it right. And it's been extremely valuable. People from Boulder have been extremely helpful. In their own way. No, I can remember in a meeting in one of these rooms right here. Okay, back in 1994, we did a thing called the Plutonium Vulnerability Study. Somehow the Department of Energy decided they wanted to do this. They were going to go through Rocky Flats, determine what the real safety risks were, and write a report on it. And they also decided they were going to involve the public to some extent. Two of us from the state became part of that study group. And we probably spent 12 to 16 hours a day here for 3 weeks with these federal experts, going through each and every building, looking for the real safety hazards, and writing up a report about this big. But they also involved the public in it. They allowed the public to hire an expert who would sit on the panel and go into the buildings and do this study. But I remember the first meeting, sitting down with the public and having some people from Boulder in particular look at us and we would say, well, we're the state health department, we're your representatives, we're going to sit here and we're going to work with these people on this vulnerability study. And I remember having them look at us and say, we don't trust you at all. We need our own person on that because we don't trust the state health department. And you can bet that bothered me, okay? I think from my perspective, at least, I spent the next 4 years working to try to explain to them that we were on their side and we were there to protect the public and not Kaiser Hill or DOE or any of the operators out here. And when finally, after 4 or 5 years, I would have people from the public say, you know, the health department is our representative and they're doing a good job and they're communicating with us and they're getting it cleaned up and they're making the place safe. That was one of the most satisfying things in my entire life, to have that change take place in the public perception.
Is it hard being on site to be a representative of the public when you're, you know, obviously working so closely with people who are representing other interests?
To me, the answer is no. Would it be for some people? You know, you do have to be very careful. You've got to guard against when you work with, for example, the people on Building 776 on this decommissioning project. We work with them every day. We sit down every morning and look at the plans for the day and what they're going to do and how they're going to do it. And when you work with them every day, you have to be very, very careful not to fall in that trap. But it can be done.
Is there ever any antagonism that you, in fact, are not on their side in these situations? That you are the public rather than part of the team?
Well, there hasn't been lately, okay? Because I really believe that some of the people I work with, at least, realize that what they're doing, cleaning up this plant, taking the buildings down, sending the contamination out as waste, they're doing it for the same people I'm doing it for. I mean, the public is the final customer of what's happening out here. I mean, the federal government, even, you know, if they get their paychecks from Kaiser Hill, if they get their paychecks from DOE, they're still doing this cleanup to make the public happy. They wouldn't be doing it otherwise.
Has your official role at Rocky Flats ever conflicted with your personal feelings about the place, like the cleanup and the mission and?
I can't think of a way that it has.
Have your feelings about Rocky Flats changed since coming on site and working there here?
And now, right offhand, I don't think so. But maybe if you could clarify that question, like for example.
Well,
I don't want to blow off the question, but I can't think of a way to answer that. Yes.
Well, maybe before you came on site, you thought it was more dangerous than after being on site for a while, or vice versa, or
No, I don't think that. I don't think it has. I mean, except in this respect, because Rocky Flats has changed. My impressions have changed. When I came on in '92, one of my primary responsibilities was emergency response. We would have emergency response drills several times a year. We'd activate the old emergency operations center and pretend that something bad had happened. What would we do if there was a fire in so-and-so? And and from the state health department perspective, there was the potential of a dose that would necessitate evacuation as far as Greeley at some time over the past 12 years. That is gone now, and that's wonderful. I mean, that's one of the big accomplishments of the last 12 years. Whether we leave a little bit of contamination in the soil, which is not a good thing, we still have done away with the potential for a dose that would cause the evacuation of Greeley in places that far away.
I guess wrapped up in that question is, you were there as the change of mission happened.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess there's a question about your feelings about the cleanup versus your feelings about being monitoring a production facility as well, or I mean, your perception of your job must have changed.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, yeah, because as the mission changed, definitely. When I started, we were monitoring a production facility, and they hoped to go back into production.
Mm-hmm. So,
which came with many possible negative consequences, including that emergency response function.
So, I'm
I
wondering.
mean, when early on it was so different. I mean, they had the state tied into their occurrence reporting system, and anytime there was an unusual occurrence out here, we would get paged. And unusual occurrences, by the very strict classification system they adopted back in '92, came often. There are things called glove box overheat alarms. Okay, little sensors inside the glove box that anytime they would sense an increase in temperature, they would let the fire department know, and somebody would have to go check and find out what's going on. Now these things would go off. They were sensitive. They would go off sometimes 8 or 9 or 10 times a week, okay? And it would be a false alarm. But nevertheless, at 3 o'clock in the morning, the pager would go off, and I'd have to call in here and find out what the problem was, and it would be a glove box overheat alarm or something like that. It was labor intensive. It took a lot of time back then. This emergency response pager would go off a dozen times a day with some sort of unusual event. And over the course of, what's it been, 92 to 12, 13 years, it goes off once every 3 weeks now with something that's usually not a major problem.
So is your anxiety level decreased?
Much, very much, yeah.
I wonder how you feel about nuclear industry and national security in the aftermath of the Cold War, and perhaps how you felt about it.
Could you
during the
refine
Cold
that
War.
question a little bit more?
Well, let me ask you it this way. How did you feel about the mission of Rocky Flats, producing bombs, producing elements of bombs, when it was in production, and...
Okay, let's start with that?
Yeah.
Let's start with that one.
Okay.
I felt that they were performing a very valuable and necessary function at the time that they did it. Whatever your opinions of the Cold War, they helped win it, okay? And as I understand it, they helped win it by pouring so much money and energy into it that the Russians tried to keep up, and they just went broke trying to do that. At the time, I thought what they were doing was very important. Now, in 2005, there's no reason to build another nuclear weapon.
I understand there's plans to reproduce the production lines at Rocky Flats elsewhere in order to do such a thing.
There was a fella I worked with here. he was instrumental in taking Building 707 down. Vic Pizzuto, I don't know if you've interviewed him.
Trying to.
Yeah, he's down and he's in Washington now, in Hanford. He left a couple months ago. And he did a wonderful job on the 707 project in getting things done and getting things done safely and organizing it. And he's a relic of the old nuclear weapons era. He built bombs for decades out here and knew these buildings inside and out. Amazing mind. And at his going away party, he didn't really want to go to Hanford. He took the job out of duty more than desire. People would ask, well, what do you really want to do now that you've left Rocky Flats? And his answer was, I want to go to Los Alamos and build bombs again. I didn't say anything. I had too much respect for the man, but I'm thinking, why?
So has your work at Rocky Flats changed you personally, professionally?
That's a tough question to answer. Maybe you can help me a little bit with where you're going. Everybody changes every day. Everything changes us. So certainly I'm different from I was 14 years ago. But what did Rocky Flats have to do with that? I don't know if I could pinpoint it.
Have you learned anything about the way things get done, or?
Yes. Okay. That was a wonderful part of the job. As a regulator, you spend your whole day telling people, no, you can't do that. You shouldn't do that. That's not safe. The classic regulator answer is, you haven't given us enough information to verify that you can do this safely. Rocky Flats has been a fascinating project in that we have learned how to work with someone and regulate them and frankly help them get things done rather than stop them from getting things done. Most of the time a regulator is stopping somebody from doing something, and here you've heard the word collaborative process. It really has worked. It really has worked. People sitting down and talking about things and how what the best way is to get something done, because when you license a uranium mill, it's easy to sit back and say, you haven't given us enough information to show that you can build this and operate it safely, so we will deny your license and say you can't do it. But here at Rocky Flats, everybody wanted the same end. Everybody wanted it torn down safely. And so rather than saying, no, that's not good enough, come back in another year with a better plan, you sit down and work out a better plan. And so that has been different.
We're out of time, so I'm going to stop it. And then,
Okay.
Cold War Museum Oral History Project. This is Ed Kray, our second tape. I'm Hannah Nordhaus. It's the 3rd of February, 2005. We're at Rocky Flats. You hear all the Rocky Flats noises around us. And we were just finishing up with a few questions that we had just discussed. What had we just discussed? I guess how your happiness with, pleasure with your role as a regulator not always being in collaboration rather than than always saying no. I'm wondering if you had any frustration with the legal limitations of your job at times.
That's a really good question, because much of what happens out here at Rocky Flats is not controlled by simple laws and regulations. Okay, when we regulate a uranium mill, we've got a set of regulations. You can do this, you can't do that, you have to give us this. Um, in the state's relation with Rocky Flats, laws have not had a lot to do with it, okay? Because there is not a set of laws that gives us the authority to regulate Rocky Flats, all right? Except for CERCLA Superfund, and I'll get to that in a minute. We came in pretty much on a do-it-right basis. Okay, find out what's going on, communicate with the public, work in their best interest, do whatever is necessary. And it has pretty much gone that way over the last 14 years. And Al Hazel is the guy who set up that relationship with Bob Nelson back in 1989, 1990. That was a very experimental period in establishing a relationship with a federal agency who prior to that time had been super secret and felt no need to tell you anything nor let you onto the site, period. That was an incredible change in 1989, 1990 when the state first came out here.
So, in terms of limitations, if
Well,
they weren't legal, were they?
The only limitation for me has been the Superfund law. And when we would have to work in conjunction with EPA, and some EPA attorney would say that you can only ask them for this much because that's all Superfund requires, okay? I always felt that the state working without this Superfund law was getting a lot more done than the attorneys saying you must give us this much. And when you have a law like that, it sets a limit. Someone is going to give you as much as the law requires and nothing more. And working with the state relationship where we can just ask for everything, and if it's reasonable, they'll consider it, has been a much better way to regulate a facility.
Do you see any value in the Superfund law?
It got the whole process started.
Something would have happened without it, though. Or no?
I don't know. It may not have. So it was valuable in that respect. It got it started.
But do you sense that it's a little too rigid?
Yes, exactly.
Now, it has not been reauthorized, has it?
I don't know.
Is it still a factor for you?
No, it isn't. It really hasn't been. The last year or two.
Whoa.
They were on a track here to clean it up, and we just followed the track, and whether there was a Superfund reauthorization, it didn't make a difference. It was we were going to clean this place up.
Has it been hard, besides Superfund, I guess, to work with other EPA or DOE folks, besides the folks on the plant? What's been your relationship with the other federal agencies?
Generally, it hasn't been a problem. There have, in the last 6 years, there hasn't been a lot of interaction with other agencies, other federal, although it was kind of a joke. Whenever you would hear someone from Washington was coming here, okay, okay, here come the guys from Washington and they're going to help us. Laugh, laugh, chuckle, chuckle, they always got in the way. Okay, there was always an attorney saying we can only do it this way. So I was much happier not seeing anyone from Washington out here.
So, are you going to retire soon?
Yes, I am.
You are?
Yes.
And, what's your plans after retirement?
I should have some, shouldn't I? The first thing I'm going to, and this has nothing to do with Rocky Flats, okay? I'll be off for a month, and then I'm going to take 6 weeks this summer and go to school at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow, Poland. They have a 6-week summer program in language, art, culture. I'm going to see a different side of life. We were there 2 years ago and fell in love with the city, and just want to go back and live there and really understand what it's like to live in in a European city in a world completely different from this one.
So will you have any regrets about leaving your work at Rocky Flats?
No. No. I mean, about the leaving part, my projects are done. It's time.
Will someone take your place?
No. The projects will be done. All the other people in our unit will need to find some other job to do in another area in 6 months or a year. And they asked me if I wanted to do that, and I said, well, no, this is a good time to leave.
So just have...
I mean, it's a fact. Have you talked to Steve Gunderson?
Not yet.
Yeah, you will. He's made the point, and he's absolutely correct. It is rare for anyone, particularly a regulator who sits there and pushes paper all day, to be involved with a project where you could see so much happening so quickly and come to a defined end where something has really happened. And that's a good time and place to leave.
A couple more questions. I'm wondering if you ever encountered any personal or professional criticism or harassment because of your role and the actions you took at Rocky Flats.
From whom? Anyone?
Anyone. Protesters, regulators.
Well, I told you about
employees.
the situation with the activists who said we just don't trust the health department. That's one good example. There was a lot of that. There was an incredible amount of distrust for the health department back in the early 90s.
For any reason?
You'd have to ask them. Okay? I didn't see a reason.
Was there a sense that you guys were in bed with Rocky Flats? because
Sure.
of your
I think so.
working
I
relationship?
think that's what the Rocky Mountain Peace Center believed. And I took it as a challenge. I took it as a challenge to prove them they were wrong about that.
And now your relationship with them is...
Well, interestingly, they don't come out here much anymore. We seem to have dropped off their radar screen of interest.
That's a good thing, I suppose.
I guess.
Just to finish up, I was wondering if you had any memory of the FBI raid.
No, I came about 2 years after that. Yeah.
So there wasn't a big buzz at the health department, even if you weren't on site about it.
No, I knew as much as I read in the newspapers at the time.
And I guess I'm just wondering if, and you may have already said this, you have already said this in various questions, but if you want to sum it up, just the best and worst things about working out here.
The best things are seeing something get done. I mean, the change from something that, I've talked all about that. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. The worst things, I can't think of too many.
And always a challenge?
Yes. I mean, it's a first. This is the point that I would make. Nobody has ever taken down a nuclear weapons plant before. And so there was something new every single day. And these guys out here had to develop new methods to do it. There was nothing in the can. There was nothing in the cookbook to tell them how to do it. And so that makes for an interesting and a good day when you're developing new methods every day.
Okay. Anything else that we missed?
I think that's it.
Okay, well, I really appreciate your participation. Thank you very much.
Welcome.